Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Hayoti. I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Teachers College, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the Alumni Career Development webinar series featuring Donna Volpitta. The webinar series covers a range of career topics and includes speakers from a variety of backgrounds. The series is co-sponsored by the TC Office of Career Education and Professional Development and the Office of Alumni Relations. Videos of past webinars are available on our website at www.tc.edu/alumni/career-webinars. Today, alumni Dr. Volpitta will present the Resilient Mindset Model, the Neuroscience of Mindful Choices. Donna is the founder of the Center for Resilient Leadership, a company focused on brain-based education. Donna created the Resilient Mindset Model, which is a simple model that teaches the brain's response to challenge. She co-authored the book, The Resilience Formula, a guide to proactive, not reactive parenting, and is co-creator of the Nametags Education Program. Dr. Volpitta holds board positions for One Revolution Foundation and Kids Helping Kids, both of which develop resilience in youth. She's an expert contributor for Understood.org, a global presence ambassador for Parenting 2.0, and a coach for Ya That Game, a collaborative of life skills educators. She presents at conferences throughout the country. Dr. Volpitta is a former classroom teacher with experience in both general and special education. She holds a doctoral degree in learning disabilities from Teachers College, Columbia University, and lives in New York with her husband and 4 children. In this webinar, questions may be asked throughout the session. And I'll give the word now to Donna.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I know sometimes it's really difficult to get into webinars and such, but hopefully everybody's started the school year and gotten everything settled in. So hopefully we can get a good attendance here. I do want to reiterate that you can use the chat box to ask any questions throughout the webinar. What I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit different. It's a little bit unusual look at the brain. It's a very simple model, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I will be happy to answer them as we go through. So we will get started. We're going to be learning today about the Resilient Mindset Model. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about how, see if I can switch there. I got feedback from somebody that when I do a webinar, I should put a picture so that people know what I look like, because sometimes in webinars it can be a little bit strange to be on the phone and hear somebody. So that's me, and I am the founder of the Center for Resilient Leadership. I was a teacher by trade. I started my career working at a residential treatment facility up in New Hampshire, which was sort of this trial by fire, working with some of the most difficult kids that they really basically had a choice of coming to us or going into jail. And so it was sort of a trial by fire. I wasn't even certified in special ed, and I was working with these kids up at a residential facility, which I guess was what planted the seeds for trying to think about the idea of resilience. I went from there and got my master's degree in special education because I thought if I wanted to work with these kids, I needed to understand a little bit more about special ed, and that was up in Boston at Boston University. And then I moved down to Connecticut to be with my husband at the time, and became a classroom teacher with students with learning disabilities. And that is where I really began to get the idea of kids working together and began to really look at how kids learned and how kids were developing. Left my job to go get my doctoral degree at Teachers College, had a great experience there, and really ended up studying Vygotsky. So I'm not sure how many of you out there have done some studying of Vygotsky, but he's an an educational theorist who was sort of at the same time as Piaget, but Piaget, is much better known. But I really loved Vygotsky's ideas. And I graduated Teachers College when my third child was 3 days old. So she actually came with me in the Bjorn to my graduation and nursed the whole time, which I think shocked everybody at Teachers College. I walked down to get my degree, and here was this infant with me. So when I graduated, I had these ideas that I had learned and such wonderful things that I had learned at Teachers College, and thought, okay, I'm gonna take these theories and use them on what I call my guinea pigs, my 4 children. And right now those guinea pigs are 10, 12, 14, and 15. So I've spent about the last 12 years developing these theories and thinking about Vygotsky's work and how to incorporate it and how to do these, how this relates to raising children. Had sort of a life-changing experience, and the whole idea that I had started with developing social language in children turned into how to develop resilience in children. I wrote the parenting book, The Resilience Formula, A Guide to Proactive, Not Reactive Parenting, and that was published about 6 years ago. And right after it was published, I thought, the key piece that I'm missing here, I have a doctoral degree in education, and I know nothing about the brain. I've done no courses about neuroscience or the brain. So I went back and spent a long time studying the brain and trying to understand it. And I set out to create a model to help people understand the brain's response to challenge. And I wanted it to be easy enough for a 6-year-old to understand, because my youngest at the time was 6, but I wanted to be able to apply it to any challenge from the playground to the boardroom. So it took me a while, and a couple of years ago I was at a conference, and I saw a neuroscientist there, and I said, I have this theory I'd really like to put past you, and I told her all about the model. There were no visuals at that point, and I'm telling her all about the model, and I said, so does it work? And she looked at me and she said, well, unbelievably, yes, it does. And she's been working with me ever since. So in this, I wanted to let you know that, no, I am not a neuroscientist, and I never claimed to be. But I have been working with Princey, that neuroscientist, ever since 3 years ago. So she has looked at all of this to make sure that it is neuroscientifically accurate. So all of the resilient mindset model and all of the stuff that I'll be talking about, I have spoken to several neuroscientists about, in particular Princey. So we are going to learn a little bit about the brain today. What we're going to be doing is bringing together 5 core concepts. Really, when I go into schools, when I talk to people, these are the key terms. These are the things that people say, oh yeah, in our school we do mindfulness. Oh yeah, we're learning a lot about resilience. Our theme this year is resilience. Oh, we teach growth mindset. We want kids to learn leadership. I don't hear as much about the neuroscience, although it's beginning to come into play. But what I wanted to do was pull these together, let people know how they work and how they fit together. Because really, if you're doing mindfulness, you have to understand how it fits into the resilience and the growth mindset and the leadership. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll really have an understanding of how these core concepts fit together and how they play into one another, and be able to apply those whether you are leading your own children or your class of children, or if you're a corporate leader leading your team in their projects. No matter what type of leadership we're talking about, this all applies. I'm very much into universal ideas. All right? So this is a visual of the model, which you can see on my website as well. And right now it probably makes very little sense, which makes sense. And what we're going to be doing in the webinar is breaking it down into its individual pieces and then I'll bring this back up, and all of a sudden, all of this will make sense. All right? So here we go. The resilient mindset model has 3 parts. The first part is called the 4 S's of resilience, which is a framework that we can use to prepare for, handle, and reflect on any challenge. And when we do that, we're building more resilient brain pathways. The second part is what I call the 4 characters of the brain. And each of those characters explain the brain's natural response to challenge. So how were we hardwired to respond to challenge? And the third part of the model is REACTS, which is an acronym that stands for the social threats and rewards to the brain, because particularly in this day and age, we need to understand how the brain responds to social threats as well as physical threats. Now, I don't see any questions yet in the chat room, but I know that a few other people have joined into the webinar. So before I move on and start to talk about each part, I would like to reiterate that if you have any questions during this webinar, you can always ask questions while I'm speaking, and Sarah will be sending them to me as you type them in. So please use the chat room and ask questions as they come along. So let's get started. We're going to start with the 4 S's of resilience. When I started talking about resilience, when I turned from speaking about social language of Vygotsky to how do we handle challenges, I use the term resilience. Often people use the term grit, people use other terms. I have always used grit and resilience interchangeably, and I happen to use the term resilience. And I define resilience as our response to any challenge, good, bad, big, or small, because we need the same tools to deal with good challenges and bad challenges, big challenges and small challenges. So I always say our resilience is our response to any challenge, and that resilience is based on the way that we think about 4 S's. Self, who are we? What do we stand for? What are our strengths and weaknesses? How do we feel about ourself and all of the thoughts that go along with that? Situation, how do I judge that situation and put it into perspective? And then can I break it down into its doable parts? So if I have a challenge that is big, can I break it down into first step, second step, third step? Supports, do I have people to go to ask for help? And do I know how to ask them? So much of the research on resilience and response to things like floods, we've certainly seen a lot of this in the news lately with the hurricanes. All of the research on how people respond to challenges is really, so much of it is based on what were the supports that were in place. I think back to when we had Hurricane Irene here, or Hurricane Sandy, I apologize, Hurricane Sandy. And my town was out of power, 100% of the town was out of power for 2 weeks. And we have an organization in town that was able to bring a hot meal, 3 hot meals a day, every day for that 2 weeks to all of the seniors in town and all of the people who couldn't get out of their house. So they had those supports that were in place when they faced that challenge. So really the idea of having people to go to for help and knowing how to ask for that, how to access that help. And finally, strategies. Do we have a strategy to handle that challenge? If that one doesn't work, do we have another one that we can go to? If that one doesn't work, do we have another? And eventually, do we know when to cut our losses and say, you know what, I'm not going to handle this one. I'm giving up. And a lot of people don't realize that sometimes giving up is an effective strategy. If you're beating your head against the wall, knowing when to stop doing that and cutting your losses is really critical. When my kids were in karate at one point, I would walk into the studio and they would have this big poster that said, "Never give up." And I used to tease the karate instructor that no, it's knowing when to give up, that sometimes it's better to give up than it is to keep going. So it's really important when we think about those 4 S's, self, situation, support structures, and strategies. The reality of those is really irrelevant. Our response has to do with the way we think about those 4 S's. So we may be handling the exact same situation, the exact same challenge, but people will respond differently because they think of those 4 S's differently. One person may think of themselves as stronger and more able. Another person might think, no, I could never do that. One person might have a lot of supports in place. The other person might not know how to access their supports. So it doesn't matter the reality of those. It's really the way that we think about them. So we're going to talk a little bit now about brain development so that we can understand why those 4 S's are important as a framework. When children are born, their brains are like a jungle. So see this picture here, but think of it as just a really dense jungle. When children are born, they are born with all these neurons, and it's kind of like a jungle. And every experience we give them builds pathways through that jungle. The neurons fire, and the more they fire, the clearer that pathway becomes. So each time we give them that experience, it begins to clear a pathway more and more and more. So the first time they do it, it's not very clear. But then, oh, I apologize for that. I'm not sure why. Oh, I apologize. Each time they go down that pathway, it gets clearer and clearer. When we are in adolescence, our brains go through 2 things. They're trying to become a more efficient brain. So we have 2 things that our brain is aiming to do. One is pruning, one is paving. So those areas of the brain that we've never used in those 12 years before that begin to go away. So that's where the term use it or lose it comes from. So if I've never learned to speak Chinese by the time I'm 12, I was born with the neurons to hear every sound in Chinese. But if I haven't used those, they begin to disappear. Those neurons disappear. I can learn Chinese later in life, but I will always have an accent because I've lost those neurons, the ability to hear those sounds. So that's pruning, is just when those neurons begin to go away. Paving is the idea that these pathways that we have continued to go down over and over and over again begin to get paved with something called a myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is a fatty substance, and it makes those pathways faster. So between the ages of 12 and 25, what we're doing is we're pruning and paving the brain pathways so that we're creating that adult brain. We can always have neuroplasticity. We can always change brain pathways, but they become more permanent because if you think about paving, they're faster, but they're more permanent. So that's why it's so much harder as adults for us to learn new things. But the things that we've learned, we can do faster because those pathways are paved. I hope that makes sense for how the brain develops. So the other thing about the brain is that it works really well for the brain to have a framework. Actually, before I go on, thinking, and I was speaking to Sarah before this phone call, and she has some young children. So I want to give an example of building brain pathways, that we can actively help children build those brain pathways. And one of the things that parents often say to me is, how do you get your kids to say please and thank you? And I always say, what do you say to them? And very often what happens is a parent will say, a child will say, can I have a cookie? And then the parent says back, what do you say? And the child says, please. So the pathway that they've learned is, can I have a cookie? What do you say? Please. So they're going down that pathway, and that pathway is reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. They're not going to learn to say, may I have a cookie, please, unless that's the language pathway that you are developing. So we're constantly feeding into what language pathways are we developing here? How are we developing those brain pathways? So I like to give that example because it really is a clear example of those brain pathways. So the other thing about the brain is that the brain really likes organization. Just like we give kids outlines in school to help them organize that information, and we can use those time and time again, and that gets the information, it makes the information easier to remember and understand. When we give our brain a framework, it helps it to understand. So those 4 S's, and I'm going to go back to that just to show you again, is the 4 S's, self, situation, support structures, and strategies, can be used as a framework to prepare for, handle, and reflect on any challenge. And when we do that, we are able to build more resilient brain pathways and pathways that are set for a growth mindset. Anyone who knows Carol Dweck's work, she wrote about the growth mindset and how important it is for kids to be successful, to feel like I can work harder and I can do better. And I saw her speak a few years ago, and she said one of the things that she's noticed is that people are sort of saying, well, you know, as long as they tried, that's a growth mindset. But it's not. It's important that we're learning for what can I do better the next time. And when we are preparing for, handling, and reflecting on challenges using these 4 S's, we are building that growth mindset. What strategies are you going to use? If that one doesn't work, what else are you going to try? What's the situation? Can you break it down into those doable parts? What are the strengths that you bring? Who are the supports that you can go to if you need help? During the challenge, you can set back to them the same questions. Is your strategy working? If it's not, what other strategy can you use? Have you used your supports? And then reflecting after that challenge, saying, did your strategy work? What would you do the next time? What supports did you use? Were there others that you didn't access? Was there a strength of yours that you had that you didn't access? All of these are ways that we can begin to ask questions, and we can use that framework to build more resilient brain pathways. So that is the first part of the model, the 4 S's of resilience. And I know that a lot of you are saying, wow, how are we going to get through this in another half an hour? And I promise this next part is easier. I think the 4 S's are kind of the most important thing to understand. So again, I don't see any questions. If this is clear, that is fine. If not, please feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have any question that I can answer. All right, if not, we covered the 4 S's of resilience. We're going to move on to the 4 characters of the brain. We think of choices that we make as good or bad. We think we make good choices. We think we make bad choices. Our brains actually do not interpret choices in good or bad. Our brains interpret choices as long-term versus short-term. Is something going to benefit me in the long term, or is something going to benefit me in the short term? And different parts of our brain are in charge of long-term and short-term. And these characters represent the different parts of the brain. So we're going to introduce each individually. We have the ant here, who lives in the cortex of the brain. The dragonfly lives in the prefrontal cortex. The grasshopper represents the limbic system, which is our emotional brain, which is this blue part here. And then the glowworm represents the amygdala, which is this red part here. So I will introduce each of them and tell you a little bit about each, but just wanted to show you the visual of where they are in the brain first. So here's the ant. Ant is kind of like a Boy Scout here. He is in charge of our long-term decisions, putting money in the bank, going for a run, eating the salad, ordering healthy, all of the things that are going to benefit us in the long run. He lives in the cortex of the brain, and he carries the tools for optimum brain performance. So a walkie-talkie, our social connections, help us make those long-term decisions, usually. Sleeping bag, we need to have rest in order for our ant to work really well. Snacks, we need to have good nutrition for the ant to be in place and work well. Exercise helps the ant to work really well, helps us to make those long-term decisions. Maps or frameworks, the ant is the one who wants those 4 S's. He wants an outline to help him study, all of that stuff. Binoculars focus, the ant can only do one thing at a time. He does it well. He's very focused. He cannot multitask. And the last tool is a merit badge that stands for compassion, pride, and gratitude. There's a psychologist out of Boston named David DeSteno, and he wrote a book called Out of Character, and he was the one, he puts people into moral dilemmas for his job and sees how they respond, and he was the one who came up with the idea of that our brain doesn't look at good versus bad, it looks at long-term versus short-term. And in his latest research, he found that when he put people into positions and experiences where they experienced compassion, pride, and gratitude, they were much less likely to cheat, steal, and hurt other people. So they made better long-term choices when they had experienced compassion, pride, or gratitude. So the ant holds all of these tools. When he has these tools in place, he makes better long-term choices, and we make better long-term choices. Now we'll move to the grasshopper. He was the one who lived in the blue part there, the limbic system of the brain. That is our emotional brain, and our emotional brain is really only looking out for the here and now. The grasshopper doesn't really care what happens next week. He doesn't care what happens next year. He doesn't care what happens in the future. He wants to have fun. He wants to eat the brownie and the chips. He wants to go play and do video games. He wants to get that little like on social media. Social media is definitely grasshopper food. All of those likes and all of those dings when we hear that we get an email. He's very social. He wants us to interact with people. He's strong. He's fast. And he represents the limbic system. And he really wants all those things here and now. These other representations of the grasshopper, this one here, our limbic system is where we get that dopamine response. So when we work really hard towards a goal, the grasshopper is actually the one that gets that yes feeling when we're really, really excited because we worked hard and we succeeded. And the reason that I put this visual in here is that I say that this represents the fact that self-esteem is not a gift that you can give to your kids. It's actually a neurochemical response that we rob them of every time we do something for them that they can do themselves. So often we now are trying to overprotect our kids and we don't want them to fail, but it's only in that failing and trying and trying and trying again that they can ever get that big burst of dopamine that they get from really working hard towards a goal and succeeding. And so we really rob them of that if we're doing too much for them. The other representation is the grasshopper in fight or flight, and we will be getting to that in just 1 minute when we move on to learn a little bit about the glowworm. The glowworm lives in the amygdala, which was that little red part of the brain in that visual, and the amygdala is a piece of the limbic system that has a very special job. The amygdala was there for survival. And so the main job of the amygdala is to look out for threat. When our amygdala experiences any threat, so if we see a car coming at us, the glowworm will go red alert, which is this last one right here. And let me see whether I put in that slide. Yes. She'll go red alert, and her job is to switch control of the brain from the ant to the grasshopper in fight or flight. And when she does that, we get that neurochemical response. The grasshopper jumps out of the way, and we don't get hit by the car. If she didn't do that, we would never get out of the way of the car because the ant is slow and methodical. He can only do one thing at a time, and he would still be thinking about it as we got crushed. So the job of the amygdala is to switch control of the brain and let our limbic system get those neurochemical fight or flight responses to get us out of the way. What a lot of people do not know, however, is that our brain, the amygdala or the brain, responds in the exact same way to social threats and rewards as it does to physical threats and rewards. And this actually comes from an fMRI study. And what they did was they put people into an fMRI machine and they hurt them physically. I'm not actually sure what they did, but they caused them pain physically. And then they had them playing a video game, and in the video game they were left out. It was sort of like a game of catch, and they were left out. People stopped throwing it to them. So they were hurt socially. And the same part of the brain responded in the same way. So our brain in some ways doesn't interpret the difference between social and physical pain or harm. They also did the same study and beforehand gave the participants aspirin. And the aspirin had the same effect on the social pain as it did on the physical pain. The same areas of the brain lit up, the same areas of the brain were dulled with the aspirin. So our brain in some ways has trouble interpreting the difference between social and physical pain. So when we feel social pain, we're actually hurting. Our brain is interpreting that as pain. So REACTS is an acronym to help us understand the social threats and rewards to the brain. What can cause our brain social pain? And it's any threat to respect, equity, alliances, control, territory, or similarity. So if we feel like we're going to be disrespected, if we feel like things are not equal, you often hear that's not fair from toddlers or from, really anybody. That's not fair. If we feel like we're not getting a fair deal, now that doesn't mean that everything has to be equal. We just have to feel like we're getting the fair deal. I often say to my children, fair is not equal. And that can be different for different people. Some people may be willing to do 90% of the work, and some people may only be willing to do 10% of the work before their grasshopper feels like it's unfair. Alliances, we were born as social beings. Our ancestors were social because that helped keep them alive. The social people were the ones who survived. So alliances are critical. If we feel like alliances are threatened, we are likely to go grasshopper. Control doesn't mean we always have to be in control, but our brain does not like it when it feels out of control. Our brain likes organization. It likes to know when things are coming. So if we don't feel in control, our grasshopper can take over the brain and be ready for fight or flight because we're worried that maybe something will go wrong. Territory, if it's my class, my kids, my project, I'm much more likely to go grasshopper faster. I was just talking with Sarah about this before our call, and we were talking about how when it's your kid, how quickly you can go into grasshopper mode and they can affect you so much more than anybody else's. And lastly, similarity. Our ancestors were in a tribe. People who were similar to them were not as much of a threat. So it doesn't mean that um, we can't be friends with people who are not similar, but it does mean that we are hardwired to just be a little bit cautious of that. Now, you can bridge that similarity, and the similarity doesn't have to be that big. You can bridge and get the grasshopper to calm down with any point of similarity. So if there is any threat to any one of those, the glowworm also goes red alert, and she calls out the grasshopper. And when she does that, we make decisions that we may consider bad, but our grasshopper really just thinks of them as short-term decisions. So if we're in the middle of class and we're afraid that, okay, we didn't do our homework last night, we're about to be asked a question, we're going to make a fool out of ourselves in front of all of our friends, and so the glowworm goes red alert, calls out the grasshopper, and he says, if I get kicked out of class, I won't have to be embarrassed. So he throws a pencil across the room. We think of that as a bad decision. The grasshopper thinks he did his job just fine, and he doesn't really care about the fact that he's going to get suspended because he doesn't care about those long-term choices. That's not his job. That's the ant's job, and the ant will have to deal with that punishment. But if we expect kids who are in grasshopper mode to think about the long-term consequences, we're kind of kidding ourselves, because when we're in grasshopper mode, it's really difficult to think about those long-term choices. Finally, we have the dragonfly. The dragonfly lives in the prefrontal cortex, which is the executive director of the brain. She's in charge of the executive functions, which are things like planning, organizing, self-control, impulse control, all of those sort of higher level thinking skills that we have. And the dragonfly is in charge of mindfulness, self-awareness, and situational awareness. And in this, I think about the idea of mindfulness of, if you see, she can sort of take a bird's eye view. She can fly, so she can sort of look over the brain, and she can say, I'm in grasshopper mode right now. What do I want to do here? Or this other person is in grasshopper mode. How do I want to respond to this? And she has those 4 S's on her wings to help her with how she might respond. My favorite story of this is, as I told you, my youngest son was 6 when I began to develop this, and I used to talk about the ant and the grasshopper all the time. And there was one night when my 6-year-old was really angry at me, and I was really angry at him. I have no idea why now, but I remember going to talk to him, and he turned to me and he said, Mom, I can't talk to you right now. I'm in grasshopper mode. And really, that's what we want. We want that mindfulness, the awareness of the situation to say, I'm in grasshopper mode right now, and if my mom talks to me, I'm going to scream at her and do things that will get her mad at me. And so I want to my strategy is to tell her I can't talk right now. And truth be known, I was in grasshopper mode too, so I should never have been going over to talk to him. And so does this always work? Certainly not. There are times when I am not exactly the dragonfly, but we can begin to implement strategies. We can begin to help each other become more aware. I've often had my kids say to me, Mom, you're in grasshopper mode. So they can give me that feedback, and I am much more likely to get away. That's sort of a trigger to say, all right, I can get away now. So the idea of the dragonfly is that mindfulness, the understanding and awareness of that situation, the self-awareness, the situational awareness, and then the ability to make a decision that's going to benefit us. The dragonfly actually does have the power to override the glowworm if she's strong enough. So here is the entire model in one visual, which I said can be found on the website. We have the ant with his tools. This is what the ant looks like without his tools. We have the grasshopper, and I talked about this being that dopamine response, and when we work hard towards a goal, and that it's important that we learn how to struggle and work hard towards that goal. This is the grasshopper in his fight or flight mode. This is the glowworm. This is in her red alert. And I forgot to explain this one. This is sort of when we begin to be stressed out, the glowworm begins to get stressed out, and something small might put us over the edge into red alert mode, even though it really wasn't a threat to our survival. So we might, when, picture it that you slept late, you're late for work, your kids spill something on you, you have to go up and get changed, you're later, then you get caught in traffic, and then when you get into work, somebody says something, and it could be something small, but you overreact. And so that awareness that, okay, I overreacted, or understanding that response. And I like to tell the story, my daughter, I guess when she was in 5th grade, in 5th grade, they assigned all the homework for the week on Monday. She was just coming back, social stuff, all this stress that happened every Monday. And so every Monday she would end up crying. And so it might be something like me saying, could you set the table? And she would go ballistic on me. And if I thought that it was about my asking her to set the table, it would have been a very different response than my understanding, I wonder what happened in school today. So often kids blow up at us at home because something has happened at school. And instead of screaming at them, you spoiled brat, how can you not set the table? Oh, I do so much for you. How can you not do this for me? The response can be, the dragonfly response of saying, you know what, this isn't about setting the table. She was in this mode, and something really small set her off into this mode. And so instead of overreacting myself, because grasshoppers want grasshoppers. When somebody's in grasshopper mode, they want a fight. So in some ways she was looking for a fight, and if I gave it to her, I was likely to say something that I regretted. So being able to say, you know what, not going to respond that way right now, is really, really powerful. And just a side note, as I said, I have a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 15-year-old, and all of them, this is their favorite. The favorite drawing is the red alert glowworm, and they said they spend most of their day in that mode, in middle school especially. So any of you middle school teachers out there, that's how they're feeling most of the time. So it's kind of a difficult place to be. So why is this important? As you can probably tell, I love this stuff. I am passionate about people understanding the brain because I think it can be incredibly powerful. We live in a world right now of glowworms and grasshoppers. And we look at the news, we look at the everything that's going on. We could comment on our political situation right now, and so much of it is grasshopper focused. And we have a choice of what type of brain pathways we are creating. Are we feeding the ant, or are we feeding the grasshopper? Are we feeding the dragonfly, or are we feeding the glowworm? And in this world, it's so easy to feed the grasshopper. It's so easy when our kids have to wait for something to hand them the iPhone. It's so easy for us to grab the snack that's fast and easy, that comes in the packaging. But we also need to balance. I always say I'm not an electronics person. I think that electronics can be great, but it needs to be balanced. Our brain needs balance. We need to not starve the ant and the dragonfly. We need to actively build up those pathways to delay gratification, to entertain ourselves, to do impulse control. All of those things for those executive functions, we need to be able to balance when we're feeding the ant, when we're feeding the grasshopper, when we're looking at the long term, when we're feeding the short term. And again, it's balance. I always say that I'm too ant. I need to feed my grasshopper more. I need to go and do things that are more fun. I need to, put some stuff away so that I can go play with my kids. But so often we are overfeeding the grasshopper. So mindful practice, mindful choices. I had started all of this and thinking about the mindfulness, and I always think of mindfulness as an awareness of the moment. And it was not until this past June when somebody called me on the fact that I don't meditate that they said, you know what, you really need to start if you're going to be preaching this stuff. And so I started doing Headspace and meditating 10 minutes a day. And all of the neuroscience supports the fact that mindfulness, mindful meditation, what it's really doing is it's strengthening the dragonfly, the executive functions, that it's enabling us to be more aware of the moment and be in more control of the moment. So I would advocate that this model advocates mindful practice and mindful choices, understanding the balance, making mindful choices about junk food, about use of technology, about the things that we are doing, because we need to become a more mindful society and understanding how you can balance each of the characters, because they're all really important. All right, and that's the end of the section about the resilient mindset model. And what I want to do now for the last 10 minutes is just to tell you a quick little bit about the things that I'm doing with this. CFRL up here stands for Center for Resilient Leadership. That's my organization, and I'll give you my website at the end. Pathways to Empower is a framework for brain-based learning. I did my first certifications this past summer. It's a day-and-a-half certification workshop, which enables you to teach the resilient mindset model, and it also teaches a lot about brain-based leadership. And there's also a Conveyor course. Conveyor is a new learning platform that allows you to get content via text message, and that's available on the website. And that all has to do with Pathways to Empower. And so that's focused around teaching this resilient mindset model. Second project that I'm really excited about is I'm developing an app right now to help people build their personal brand. And the idea behind this is to actively build brain pathways for the dragonfly and for the ant. And we are almost ready to test it. We almost have a prototype ready. So I'm really excited about that. And I'm working with I've been speaking to someone at Harvard University's Making Caring Common, and they are trying to change the college application process so that kids are able to reflect character and not just academic skills and that stuff. So they really want kids to be able to represent their character, and hopefully this might be a way that kids can, high school students, college students can go through the process of thinking about who they are and what they stand for. So really feeding the dragonfly and the ant. Neuroworld, I had said that I wrote a book called The Resilience Formula, A Guide to Proactive, Not Reactive Parenting. My next book is probably going to be a book series, actually, and a cartoon that is going to be a children's book series and cartoon about Neuroworld, which will take place in the brain and tell the adventures of these 4 characters. So we're really looking forward to that coming out soon, and hopefully we'll have plush toys of all these fun characters. And then a couple of just other projects that I'm working on. As Sarah had mentioned, I'm on the board of One Revolution. Chris Waddell started the foundation, and we have a resilience education program called Nametags, where Paralympic athletes tell their stories and give the message, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. And that we have speakers throughout the country, so if you're interested in an assembly program about resilience, they're really good. Kids Helping Kids is just a Connecticut-based organization teaching leadership skills through youth-led service projects. And then I just joined yeahthatgame.com. It's a collaborative of life skills educators, and we have monthly calls, so you can join coaching clubs of different types. We have digital literacy, we have financial literacy, we have Got Teens, so you can go there and learn about the coaches, and I'm one of the coaches in Rules to Tools with Dr. Shimi Kang. So we do a monthly call, and then we have check-ins through Facebook and Conveyor. So those are the things that I'm working on. I am really happy to answer any questions. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to connect with me. I do post a lot on Facebook, especially Facebook and Twitter, but Facebook especially. I post very often articles that have anything to do with those 5 core concepts that I talked about: mindfulness, leadership, neuroscience, growth mindset, and I forgot the last one. Leadership, what did I say? Mindfulness. The 5 core concepts that I had put on this slide earlier. So you can go on there and like that. Please feel free to forward any of the information. These slides I think you're going to be able to access, and please feel free to contact me. And with that, if there are no questions, I am taking a look. Are you sure there are no questions? I am also very happy to have any feedback. So if you have any feedback from the webinar today, I would really appreciate it. As I said, that I had gotten the feedback at the beginning that somebody wanted to see a picture. So I added that, and I've always trying to incorporate the feedback that I've gotten. So please feel free to send me an email or send me any information. Any last questions? I don't see any, so I will pass this back to Sarah, I think. Thank you so much for taking the hour.
Thank you again, Donna. Again, if you want to reach Donna, her information is on the screen. If you have any questions, you can surely email them to her. If you have any questions now, we can go ahead and take them. I see someone said thank you from Samantha. So thank you so much, Donna, for taking the time to share your expertise with the TC community. A video of this presentation will be available on our website at www.tc.edu/alumni/career-webinars. Please visit our website for more information about our monthly webinars. Next webinar will be on the 10th of October at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Michael Brenner, who will present Emotional Intelligence Redefining the Smart Employee. Thank you again, Donna, and thank you all for joining us, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.